Locating buttons and buttonholes. Horizontal buttonholes extend about 1/8 inch beyond the center front line. This allows for the middle of the button to be centered on the center front line when the button is closed. Horizontal buttonholes are often recommended as buttons are less likely to pop open. However, when a garment has a vertical band, vertical buttonholes are almost always used. They are to be placed in the exact center of the band and should be evenly spaced on the garment. Position the buttonhole so that the button is at the very top of the buttonhole when buttoned. The length of the buttonhole equals the diameter of the button plus the thickness. You will also have to take into consideration the surface texture of the button. Rough buttons or fabric-covered buttons require a larger buttonhole than do smooth buttons. Mark the buttonhole placement on the garment with pins or hand basting. Buttonholes are generally evenly spaced on the garment. Buttonholes on women's clothes are usually on the right front, while those on menswear are on the left side. The type of buttonhole you select depends on the fabric you are using and the style of the garment. Buttonholes that are made by machine are usually made after the garment has been completed. The opening is finished with a facing and should be interfaced for added durability. Machine-worked buttonholes give a sporty look to the garment. Bound buttonholes are made before the section containing the buttonholes is attached to other garment sections. A small square of self fabric forms the lips of the buttonhole. Machine-worked buttonholes made with special settings on the machine are made with zigzag stitches plus a bar tack at each end. Buttonholes made with a special machine attachment usually have rounded ends. These attachments can be used on machines that do not zigzag. When cutting the buttonhole, first fold the buttonhole in half by bringing the ends together. Clip through the buttonhole between the rows of stitching. Unfold and continue cutting to the ends of the buttonhole, using only the points of the shears. Be careful not to cut any of the zigzag stitching. Trim away any of the frayed threads inside the buttonhole. A trial buttonhole should be made before making buttonholes in the finished garment. Use the same garment fabric, interfacing and facing that is to be used in the garment. To locate the position for buttons, lap the two edges, lining up the center front or center back markings. On horizontal buttonholes, put a pin through the buttonhole in line with the center front marking. The button is then placed in line with the buttonhole, directly on the center front marking unless the design indicates otherwise, such as on a double-breasted jacket. On vertical buttonholes, again lap the two edges, lining up the center front markings. Place a pin through the buttonhole 1/8 inch down from the top to mark the position for the button. I find it easiest to sew on one button, then button the garment before marking the position for the next button. Making bound buttonholes. Bound buttonholes are made before the section containing the buttonhole is joined to other sections of the garment and after the interfacing has been applied. Markings for the buttonhole are drawn on the interfacing using a sharp pencil. The outer two vertical lines mark the finished length of the buttonholes. The center of the buttonhole is also the cutting line. This line extends only to the length lines. The two lines parallel to the cutting line are drawn exactly 1/4 inch away and extend about 1/2 inch beyond the two outside vertical lines or length lines. Finally, add two more lines the exact length of the buttonhole, midway between the center of the buttonhole and the basting lines. These lines will be used for the final stitching. All 5 lines should be exactly 1/8 inch apart. Machine based on the center line or cutting line. This will mark the position of the buttonhole on the right side. You can use this line to check that the buttonhole is following straight grain on the fashion fabric. Cut a rectangle following the grain line of the fabric 1 1/2 inches longer than the buttonhole length and about 2 1/2 inches wide. Fold this piece in half and place it over the marked line, centering the piece on the line. Pin in place, putting the pins near the edge of the piece. This piece may be cut on the bias if you are working with a plaid or stripe, or if you wish to cord the buttonhole. All stitching is done from the interfacing side of the garment following the marked lines. Machine based on the two outside lines or basting lines, extending the stitching about 1/2 inch beyond the vertical lines. It is important that all stitching be accurately done. Remember that this is a basting, so a longer machine stitch can be used. From the right side, fold the patch firmly against the basted line and pin. You may want to finger press along the fold to help position the material and to keep it flat. Place the pins close to the cut edge of the patch so the machine stitching will not go over the pins. Turn the garment so the interfacing side is up and stitch on the line midway between the basting line and the cutting line. This stitching should begin and end exactly in line with the two outside vertical lines. Use a slightly shorter machine stitch of about 15 stitches per inch. Unpin and repeat the same process for the lower side of the buttonhole. This step forms the folds which make the lips of the buttonhole. It is important that these lips be even in width and that they be the same length. If the folds do not appear to be the same size, remove the stitching and repeat the process. Pull the threads to the right side and tie a tailor's knot by making a loop with both threads. Pull the ends through the loop, cover with your finger, and pull the threads tight. Remove all bastings. These would include the outside two stitching lines as well as the one in the center, which was put in to check the buttonhole placement on the right side. The first step in cutting the buttonhole is to cut the buttonhole piece midway between the stitched lines. Be sure you are cutting only the patch and not the garment fabric. This should separate the patch into two pieces. Turn the garment to the wrong side and cut through the interfacing and garment fabric. Cut lengthwise to the center of the buttonhole to within 1/4 inch from the end, then diagonally to each corner. It is important that you cut exactly to each corner, but you will want to be careful not to cut beyond the stitching. Repeat the process at the other end. Cut to within 1/4 inch of the end, then diagonally to the corners. You should now be able to turn the patch to the wrong side. Work carefully to avoid any raveling of the fabric at the corners. The lips will fold to the center and fill the space between the two rows of stitching. Baste the two lips together. They should be wide enough to completely fill the rectangle created by the stitching. We are now ready to stitch the ends of the buttonhole. With the garment right side up, fold the fabric along one end, exposing the triangular-shaped end. Stitch across the end, catching the small triangle in the machine stitching. This stitching should come as close to the end of the buttonhole as is possible to keep the corners from fraying or pulling out. Repeat this process for the other end. Trim the buttonhole piece to within 1/2 inch of the finished buttonhole. Press the finished buttonhole. The lips of the buttonhole should be even in width and should meet in the center of the rectangle. Finishing bound buttonholes. The back of a bound buttonhole is finished with the facing after the garment has been completed. To finish the opening in the facing, first pin a piece of firmly woven, lightweight fabric on the right side of the facing over the area where the buttonhole is located. The piece of fabric should be about 2 inches longer than the size of the finished buttonhole and about 2 inches wide. Baste this fabric in place through the facing only. This piece of fabric will eventually be turned to the wrong side, so it need not match exactly in color. A piece of lining or interfacing fabric would work well. To determine the size of the buttonhole opening on the facing, push pins through the 4 corners of the buttonhole. These pins will go through the face fabric as well as the facing. On the facing side, mark the 4 corners on the fabric. Then connect these 4 points to form a rectangle. This rectangle should be the size of the finished buttonhole. The distance between the 2 parallel lines should be 1/4 inch, and the length of the rectangle should equal the length of the buttonhole. Since this piece will be turned to the wrong side, a pencil can be used in marking. Open up the facing and stitch the small square of fabric to the facing following the marked lines. Use a shorter stitch length of about 15 stitches per inch and overlap the stitches at the starting point. Cut through the center of the rectangle to within 1/4 inch of the end and then cut diagonally to the corners. Use the tips of your shears to avoid clipping through the machine stitching. It is important to cut all the way to, but not through, the stitching at each corner. Remove the basting threads. Turn the fabric piece through the opening to the wrong side of the facing. Pull the fabric tight against the stitching, forming a window opening, and press. If you find the fabric is difficult to press, you may want to baste around the opening. Leave the basting in until you have hand-stitched the facing to the back of the buttonhole. Trim away the excess fabric to within 1/2 to 3/4 inch from the stitching line. Position the facing over the buttonhole and pin in place. The size of the opening in the facing should be the same size as the buttonhole. Use a small slip stitch or blind stitch to attach the facing to the buttonhole fabric. Be careful that the stitches do not go through to the right side. Continue stitching around the entire buttonhole. Remove the bastings from the completed buttonhole. You may also want to do some touch-up pressing using a press cloth and just the tip of the iron. And now the buttonhole is completed. The second method of finishing the back of a bound buttonhole should be used only on tightly knit fabrics. Pin the facing in place around the buttonhole area, keeping the pins far enough from the buttonhole so as not to interfere with the machine stitching. Then from the right side, stitch in the ditch around the buttonhole using a shortened stitch length of about 15 stitches per inch. Stitch slowly and carefully so that the stitching falls in the crevice formed by the stitching which made the fabric lips. Pull the fabric taut on each side of the presser foot as you stitch. When matching thread is used, the stitching will not be visible from the right side of the garment. From the wrong side, trim away the facing material behind each buttonhole by cutting close to the machine stitching. Since this method is recommended for knit fabrics only, The raw edges should not ravel, and the finished buttonhole will not be as bulky as when the edges are folded back on the facing. Sewing on buttons. Small details are important in sewing. The appearance of a garment can be marred by so small a detail as incorrectly attached buttons. To locate the button position, lap the opening together matching center front or center back markings. Put a pin in each buttonhole to the underlayer so buttons will be placed directly under the buttonhole. Buttons are to be sewn directly on the center front or center back line unless the design indicates otherwise. Secure the end of a double thread by knotting the thread and taking the first stitch from the right side of the garment, so the knot will be hidden by the button. Take this first stitch exactly where the pin was used to mark the button position. With a button in the correct position, place an object such as a wooden match or a toothpick across the top of the button to give enough looseness to the stitch for making a thread shank. The size of the object used depends on the thickness of the fabric. Attach the button by sewing through the holes in the button and over the object many times until the button is securely attached. This may mean going through each hole 8 to 10 times. Remove the object and hold the button taut away from the fabric. Bring the needle out to the right side of the garment, so it is between the button and the fabric. Wrap the thread firmly around the stitches, forming a thread shank. You may want to go around the button 8 to 10 times. Bring the needle through to the wrong side of the garment and secure the thread with several small stitches in the same place. The shank should be long enough to allow adequate space under the button for the thickness of the buttonhole, so that the button lies flat and smooth when the garment is closed. The length of the thread shank depends on the thickness of the fabric. Some buttons already have a shank attached to the button. This shank may be adequate as is, or the button may require a longer shank if additional space is needed between the button and the fashioned fabric to compensate for very bulky materials. Sew this type of button on with very loose stitches. To form an additional shank, pull the button away from the fabric and wrap the thread firmly around the stitches underneath the present shank. Then secure the thread on the wrong side as was done before. Notice that the thread shank on this button does not need to be as long as the thread shank for a flat button, as the button shank itself holds the button away from the fabric. The length of the shank needs to be long enough to accommodate the thickness created by the buttonhole. Garments which have bound buttonholes usually require longer shanks than those having machine-made buttonholes. Attaching snap fasteners. The correct method for sewing on snaps depends on their purpose and location. On garment edges that overlap, place the ball half of the snap on the top layer of the garment. Take a small stitch in the fabric where the snap will be placed. Position the snap over the knot and sew on the snap using the blanket or overcast stitch. The blanket stitch is being demonstrated here. Notice that when making the blanket stitch, the thread is always on the outside of the fastener. To make this stitch, insert the needle from the outside of the hole and bring it up in the center of the hole, forming a loop in the thread. The needle then goes back through the loop to complete the stitch. A double thread is usually used to sew on fasteners. Slide the needle between the layers of fabric when going from one hole to the next, making sure that none of the stitches catch through to the outside of the garment. After completing the stitches in all of the holes, secure the thread by making several small stitches in the same place in the fabric. Mark the position for the socket half of the snap so that it will be directly opposite the upper snap. Place a pin on the bottom layer directly under the ball of the snap. Take the first stitch exactly where the snap is to be placed. Then position the snap on top of the knot and attach the socket half by the same procedure as was used on the ball half. To avoid having your thread become twisted, use thread lengths of only 15 to 18 inches. It is important to firmly pull each stitch before starting the next stitch. Fasteners which are attached with a blanket stitch have a neat appearance and are usually more secure than when using the overcast stitch. To review the blanket stitch, insert the needle from the outside of the snap and bring it up through the hole, forming a loop. Put the needle back through the loop to complete the stitch. Pull each stitch tight before making the next stitch. Snaps have less holding power than hooks and eyes, but can be used successfully to secure a garment overlap. They should be positioned far enough from the edge so that they will not be visible from the outside of the garment. The extended snap is used when two edges come together but do not overlap. When a snap is used in this way, the ball is placed on the underlap side, since the back of the ball half is smooth and will feel more comfortable lying next to the body. Attach the ball half through only one or two holes using the overcast or blanket stitch. The overcast stitch is probably the easiest one to use. Notice that one edge of the snap touches the garment and that the snap extends out from the garment edge. The stitches should be taken very neatly so they do not extend out into the part of the garment that will show. Secure the thread on the back by taking several small stitches in the same place. It is important to attach this half of the snap first, as it affects the positioning for the socket half. Remember that the snap may be attached through two holes if desired. Position the socket half of the snap on the garment so that the edges of the garment will come together when the snap is closed. Mark the position with a pin. Then attach the snap with a blanket or overcast stitch. When the snap is used in this manner, it takes the place of a hook and eye. I find that an extended snap holds the edges of the garment together a little better and is easier to fasten than the hook and eye. The blanket stitch is being used to attach the socket half of the snap. In this garment, the extended snap is used above an invisible zipper. Notice that the garment edges just meet when the snap is fastened. If the snap is sewn above a lap zipper, the garment edges will slightly overlap. Attaching hook and eye fasteners. Hook and eye fasteners are used to complete a closure such as above a zipper, and at points of strain or tension such as on a waistband. Position the hook on the underside of the garment overlap. It should be placed far enough back from the edge so that when fastened neither the hook nor eye are visible from the outside of the garment. The hook can be held in place by pinning near the curved end. Take the first stitch with a double thread so the knot will be hidden under the hook. Attach the hook using either a blanket or overcast stitch. A blanket stitch is being demonstrated here. Notice that when making the blanket stitch, the thread is always on the outside of the fastener. To make the stitch, insert the needle from the outside of the hole, bring it up in the center of the hole, forming a loop in the thread. The needle then goes back through the loop to complete the stitch. The stitches should be placed close enough together to completely cover the two holes. Slide the needle between the layers of fabric and bring it out near the curved end of the hook. Secure the curved end of the hook to the fabric with several overcast stitches. Be sure that none of the stitches catch through to the outside of the garment. If the hook is being used on a waistband, I do try to make the stitches deep enough to catch the interfacing on the waistband, yet being careful not to catch the outer layer of fabric. It is important that the hook be attached at each of the holes and also at the curved end to hold the garment secure when the hook is fastened. A bar-shaped eye is used when the edges of the garment overlap, such as on a waistband. Notice that the hook is attached first, and the eye is placed directly under the curved end of the hook. Mark the correct position with a pin. Place the eye over the pin and hold in place by pinning across one end. Attach the eye using either the blanket or the overcast stitch. Place the stitches close enough so that they completely cover the holes. The round eye is used when garment edges just meet, such as at the back of a stand-up collar. Again, the hook is attached first, and the eye is set back just far enough so the garment edges come together when the hook is fastened. Position the curved eye opposite the hook. Hold in place with a pin. Attach the eye using a blanket or overcast stitch. It is important that neither the hook nor eye show from the outside when fastened. A thread eye can be substituted for a metal eye. It gives a little dressier look to the garment. Mark the position for the thread eye opposite the round end of the hook. Take the first stitch, hiding the knot on the wrong side of the garment. Then insert the needle into the fabric about 1/4 to 3/8 inch away, forming the foundation stitch for the eye. Do this 2 or 3 times, always making the stitches the same length. Finish the thread eye by covering these foundation stitches with a series of blanket stitches. When sliding the needle under the threads, be careful not to miss any of the threads and avoid catching the garment fabric in the stitch. The stitches should be placed close enough together to completely cover the thread. Secure the thread on the wrong side of the garment by taking several small stitches in the same place. When closed, neither the hook nor eye should be visible from the outside of the garment.